Okay, welcome to our Creative Black and White Conversions webinar. And tonight we're going to go over a host of different processes that I use both in Lightroom and in Photoshop, and also in Silver Efex Pro, which is a plugin from Nik Filters that you can use for your black and white conversions as well. We're going to talk about a variety of things tonight. We'll talk about, we'll start off from the basics and we'll get a little bit more advanced as we go along. So we'll talk about basic black and white conversions, starting in Lightroom using the channel mixer. We'll talk about using Silver Efex Pro as a plugin for Lightroom. You can also use this as a plugin for Photoshop as well. Then we'll get a little bit more advanced. We'll talk about black and white profiles in the RAW converter. In Lightroom. You can also use these in the RAW converter in Photoshop as well. We'll talk about creating duplicate copies and doing mixed conversions. So taking a set of images of the same photo and doing different conversions for each one for greater tonal range and contrast, and then selectively blending them together inside of Photoshop. And then we'll also talk about excuse me, finishing off your images with dodging and burning, adding vignettes and split toning to the shots. And then at the very end, I'll get out of my screen view and back into this module, and I can follow up with you guys with any questions that you might have had about the presentation this evening. If for any reason you guys have any questions while I'm going along, or if you have any trouble with the video or the audio, please type those into the Q&A box that you'll see at the very bottom of your Zoom screen. You can see it's just to the right of the pause. Well, you probably won't see that on yours, but there's a Q&A box at the bottom. So you can type any questions that you may have that come up as I go along into that box. And I may not see them immediately, but I will be checking those occasionally so I can sort of field any of those questions that come in during the presentation. All right, so with that being said, I am going to share my screen. And let's go ahead and jump into Lightroom. All right, so also, by the way, this little box up here in the corner, probably in the top right-hand corner, which is a video of me, you can minimize that, and you can also move it around to anywhere you want on your screen so that it does not block any of the modules here in Lightroom. Okay, and let me just see something real quick because I want to make sure that my Q&A is up. Move this around, put this right here. And let's see. Just 1 second, folks. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. We're gonna talk about 4 photographs. We're gonna use 4 photographs tonight in our presentation, and we're gonna start off with the most basic form of black and white conversion. So I'm going to bring up a photo here for you guys to take a look at. This is a shot that I captured last winter in Death Valley National Park with a long telephoto lens. I think this was made with about a 4 or 500 millimeter lens shooting down on the dunes. And I was up there shooting this specifically for black and white conversions. It was a clear evening. I didn't have anything happening in the sky. And I knew that the way that the light would rake across the dunes would create some incredible light and shadow contrast in the image. Now, this would also work very, very well as a color photograph, but I think that the tonal range in it and the lighting and the texture is going to make for a very stunning black and white. So we'll talk about some different ways of conversion for that. Now, one of the things that I typically do in processing, especially if I wasn't shooting an image specifically for a black and white conversion, or if I'm just going through and doing what I call a dumpster dive and looking for images to convert to black and white, is the first thing I may do is when I bring it up into the develop module is just click on the treatment to black and white to see how it renders in black and white. All right. So we can see right off the bat that this image has a lot of potential in black and white. Now, what it's going to give you is the Adobe Monochrome profile, which is the most basic profile. So it's just going to give you an idea of what the image will look like. There is much that we can do to make this look far better, okay? And so with black and white conversions, the thing that you really want to create, in my opinion, for a successful black and white image is this incredible contrast and tonal range, okay, between the darks and the lights, all the way through the image with the midtones really coming through. All right, so it creates a lot of depth and a lot of separation in the tonal values. So if I look at this and I just click on the black and white, I can see that it has potential, but I can see that, you know, there's much, much more I can do to it. So one of the most basic ways that you can do a black and white conversion when you're using your raw converter, whether you're using Lightroom, which is what I use, or you're using the Adobe RAW converter or something else like Luminar, is to do what is called channel mixing, okay? So that is going to be down here under the black and white tab. Now, this will not normally be shown as the black and white tab. In fact, if you're in color, this will be seen as the HSL color tab. But as soon as you switch to a black and white conversion, it switches the name of that tab to black and white. And what you're going to see in that tab when you click on it is your channel mixer. So you're going to have your different channels: red, orange, yellow, green, aqua, blue, purple, and magenta. And what that is going to allow you to do is it's going to allow you to move these sliders around to create the tonal contrast that you want in your images, okay? So for instance, on this shot, I know that when I look at the color of the image, it's mostly yellow and red. There's a little bit of, let me just fix, oh, sorry. Hello. Thank you. Let me fix this real quick for one-to-one fill. Okay. There's a little bit of blue in the shadows, so I'm going to be able to work with the blues as well in this channel mixer down here. But you'll notice right off the bat, if I pull the yellow slider, the yellow or the orange slider up, the brighter parts of the dunes are getting much brighter. So it's moving that tonal range in that color to a brighter spectrum. I could darken it by pulling it back, and it gets very, very flat. So I want to create this sort of broad global contrast to begin with. Okay, so I will move this up. I'll look at the yellows and move that up as well. What I'm paying attention to here is my histogram. I want to make sure that as I move these tonal values up, that even though I'm looking at it with my eye and making sure that it looks good aesthetically to me, I'm not losing detail in my highlights, because when I go to print the image, if I lost detail on the highlights, it won't be a successful photograph, okay? I won't have that detail to work with in the image, in the printing process. And as I move these up, I can move these up pretty far, and it's not actually clipping out the detail in the highlights. And so I can move these around to be as bright as I want them to be. Conversely, I can start moving the blue slider back, because I know that the shadows have a lot of blue tones in them. So if I move the blue slider back, I can create this sort of broader global contrast. So this is the beginning of the conversion process in the most basic sense, is moving these sliders around in the black and white mixer to get sort of this broader contrast overall. Once that's done, you're still going to want to move up into your basic tab and start to create tonal separation in the image. So I might pull the highlights back a little bit. I might move the whites up a little bit and the blacks back a little bit to continue to create this sort of really, really broad and beautiful contrast in the image. And you can see right now, this has a lot of beautiful light and shadow play happening throughout the shot, all right? Another thing that I might do is add a little bit of texture to the image. And that's going to bring out some of the finer detail in the dunes, okay? So that is the most basic way to do your black and white conversion, is through the tonal mixer down here. Let's take a look at another image. Let me just go ahead and reset this. All right, so I cropped in on this into a panoramic mode. I didn't want to reset that. Let's just jump back into my 1 to 3 pano and reposition that. All right, there, good. But let's take a look at another shot over here. All right, this is an image of autumn color and the sun coming through that was captured in southwest Colorado. Now, you may not think about this as being a good candidate for a black and white photograph, but in fact it is, because it has a lot of variation in different colors. So you have these yellows, you have these really deep greens, you have lighter greens, you have whites, and you have blue, the sort of blue cyan, and even some magenta that's coming through in the background. So because this image has a lot of variation in color, it's going to allow me to do quite a bit with the channel mixer here to create sort of a very stunning black and white image. So a Q&A just came in, but I'm having trouble seeing the questions for some reason. Let me just take a look here for one moment, folks, and just figure that out. What's going on, why the Q&A is not popping up. And it's definitely not for some reason. All right, guys, I'm sorry, but the Q&A is not popping up in my screen while I'm working right now. So what I'm going to have to do is take any questions at the end of the session, okay? I apologize for that. I'm not sure why it's not popping up. Yeah, it's just not coming up for some reason. But anyway, let's get back to the channel mixer. So for this, when I click on black and white right off the bat, it looks pretty good. It looks pretty good. I got this beautiful light coming through the forest, have these sort of soft tones in the aspens and these darker tones in the darker leaves. But if I come down to the black and white channel mixer and I start to play with this a little bit, I'll be able to really start to separate the color quite a bit. So you can see by pumping up the yellows, I bring that out. I can bring the greens and make them darker or lighter. I would probably go with something that has a little bit more of a high key look for an image like this. Okay, so where there's a lot of light coming through the forest. Play with the blues. And that's affecting a little bit in the background, but not much. Aqua and magenta, pull those down a little bit. And maybe even the orange and the reds a little bit. So you can see by playing with that channel mixer, it allows us to go from a very basic conversion, which looks like this, to something that looks much, much, much more dramatic and interesting, all right? So this is the most basic method. Now, this is the method that I rarely ever use, okay? I rarely ever use this method for my conversions because it is the most basic and because I know that there are better ways that I can do the conversions. So for instance, one of my favorite ways to do black and white conversions is through Silver Efex Pro. And I have that is a Nik filter. And I have that loaded as a basically a plugin in both Lightroom and Photoshop. So for instance, if I want to take this image and do a more advanced version of it into a black and white conversion, I can use Nik. So I'm going to go up to Photo and drop down to Edit In and then choose the Silver Efex Pro 2 plugin. And it's going to ask me, do I want to edit this with Lightroom adjustments? And I'll just say yes, even though I really haven't done any Lightroom adjustments to the image yet. And it's going to launch the Nik filter. You can see that it's preparing to edit the file right now. It's going to launch that image into the Nik conversion, and we'll be able to go from there. And while that's doing that, I'm just going to take a look and find out what is going on with my computer. It just got slow. I'm going to stop my share for one moment, folks, and jump right back into it so I can see my Q&As. Because for some reason, the box has disappeared. I don't know where it went off to. There we go. So the question that Mark asked was, do you always start with the channel mixer, or might you first get a strong color image and then convert? Do you ever convert in Photoshop? Sometimes, yes. I'm going to go back into screen share at this point. Yeah, sometimes I will work with a very strong color image and do a conversion thereafter. It's fine. It doesn't matter where you start in this process. Some photographs I've already decided at the time of shooting the image that it's going to look better as a black and white than as a color photo. So for those, I'm going to start directly as doing a conversion. For images that I develop as a color image, I may decide as I'm going through the process that this could look really good as a black and white, and I will take whatever I've done to that photo and either do it through probably Nik or bring it into Photoshop and do a conversion in there at that point. So once we get into Nik, so as you guys can see, this is the Nik plugin right here, all right? And what you want to focus on here are essentially, let's just collapse these for a moment, 2 different areas for your conversion, okay? The first is the preset library over here, and you can look at this as a starting point for the conversion, okay? So it's coming in as neutral, but I can scroll through all of these presets, okay? And I can start looking at some variations in what the image may look like. There's the overexposed, which is a very, very high key. This is the high structure. If I zoom in, you can see when this renders, it's going to have a lot of detail because it has brought the structure up quite a bit. You can think of structure as clarity or texture, okay? So you need to be careful with it because it can start to make the image a little crunchy and really mess with it. I like to use the high structure smooth, which is 006 preset, over just the high structure preset, which is sort of a harsh preset. It's not as crunchy. You can see the structure is only set to 20 at this point, but it does do a good job on this particular image. Once again, you're just gonna wanna scroll through these and take a look and look for something that looks good to your eye. Another good one is the full dynamic smooth here. To be quite honest with you, I use 3 of these the most. 90% of the time, I'm either using the high structure smooth, the full dynamic smooth, or the full spectrum right here, which is quite nice. And sort of inverts some of the color conversion in the image a little bit. You can see the way that it does that. It makes those greens a little lighter. So it does a pretty interesting job on the image. Basically, you want to scroll through these and look for something that works really, really well for the image. Now, you don't want to go over top at this point in the process because we haven't even developed the image yet for its tonal values and for doing any dodging and burning. So something like the Fine Art High looks interesting, but it's probably, if I zoom in, it's probably a little bit too much and there's going to be a lot of grain that's associated with it. So I would recommend staying with one of these 3, the full spectrum, the full spectrum right here, the full dynamics, or the high structure smooth. Now for this particular shot, I think I like the full dynamics the most, okay? It does do a good job of bringing out a great range of tonal values to the shot, from brightest highlights to bright highlights, to lights, to midtones, to darks, and to deeper shadows. Now, I can refine this even further now that I have this preset dialed in right over here with my Silver Efex Pro 2 adjustments, okay? Under the global adjustments, I can bring up the brightness. I can increase or decrease the contrast. I would decrease the contrast a little bit for this particular shot, bring up the brightness slightly, okay? Sort of maintain that high key sort of look. I add a little bit of structure. Now, when I add structure, I'm going to zoom into 100%, let it render, and then add the structure to make sure that I don't add too much structure. Remember, structure is like clarity or like texture in the raw converter. So if you go too far with it, you can introduce some problems into your images. Now, that being said, building up grain or noise in a black and white image is not as problematic as building up grain or noise in a color image, simply because black and white traditionally, black and white prints and black and white film, a lot of times have a higher grain profile than color film would. So it's expected to see some higher grain in black and white shots. Now, you being the photographer and the artist need to decide if that's something you want to introduce to your images or not. I like a little bit of grain structure to my black and whites. I think it prints really, really well on certain papers. So I will bring the structure up a little bit to sort of maintain that look to the image. Now you also have down here tonality protection for shadows and for highlights. Right now it's sort of set about right in the middle. But if you want to protect your highlights or your shadows, you can move these sliders up. So as I move these up, it's opening up the shadows a little bit. As I move it down, it's closing the shadows down, okay? So you can think about this as a shadow and a highlight slider like you see in Lightroom or in the Adobe RAW converter. Now for this one, I may bring the shadows down a little bit to create a little broader contrast in these darker leaves set against the white aspen trees. And for the highlights, I'm actually going to open them back up a little bit more to bring out a little bit more shine through the background, okay? So those are the global adjustments. We'll get into selective adjustments in a moment, but first let's take a look at the color filter. So if you ever did any black and white work back in the day with shooting film, you know that you could use certain filters like a yellow filter or a red filter, different Ratten filters to create a higher contrast look on your black and white negatives. And you can simulate that through the color filter here in the Silver FX Pro 2 converter, okay? So we'll click through a couple of these to see the results. We'll start with the blue. Okay, that's fine. I don't like it as much. Green looks interesting. Yellow is a little too much. Orange too far. And red, I'd say it's either between red and green for this particular image. I would actually go with the green filter for this because the red filter looks a little too bright in the highlights, and I don't have as much interesting separation here in the image between the dark tones and the highlight tones, but I have a little bit more of an interesting and a little more of a subtle conversion here between all these tonal values. I want to create this great depth in the tonal values in the image where I don't want my blacks to go all the way out. I want them to be nice and rich, and my whites and my brights to be nice and rich as well, but also maintain some beautiful, you know, middle ground tones in the shot as well. So the green filter looks good. I can also change the strength of that filter down here with these sliders. So if I move the strength slider back, it's going to lessen the effect. If I move it up, it's going to increase the effect. Okay, so that's kind of a nice little tool to use. One of the other nice things you can do is to move the hue slider around. And that's a nice little thing. You can move this around and you can really nicely dial in the tonality of the shot with this, okay? If you want to really get into creating this beautiful sort of separation in the image. Okay, so as you can see, as I move it around, it's changing the global appearance of the conversion of the black and white. And still like green, I think I may like the hue slider to be set a little bit more towards the warmer version of green because it brings out a little bit more of an interesting tonal separation in the photo. All right, let's look at selective adjustments for a moment. So in the Nik filters, you have what are called control points. Control points are nice because I can drop them on an image and change things. Think of it as a selective edit, just as if you were using a radial filter or a graduated filter or an adjustment brush in Lightroom. You can sort of do the same thing with the Nik filter, which is very, very nice. So for instance, if I think this is too bright up here, I can drop a control point. And if I click on this little button right here, So you can see this is control point number 1 that I just dropped. These are all the changes that I can make to that control point: brightness, contrast, structure, amplify whites, amplify blacks, fine structure, and then finally selective colorization, okay? But if I want to see what area of the image this is affecting, just like you would with a mask, I can simply click on this little box right here. And it will show me in a bright mask. Now remember, the mask in Nik is really essentially the same sort of masking setup that you have in Photoshop, where the bright parts of the mask reveal the adjustment and the black parts of the mask conceal or hide the adjustment. So as I move this nodal point around now, you can see how that mask begins to change, because it's taking sample points based off of the pixel values that I place it on. So if I want to go for these brighter tones right up here, I just move it around until I get it right, and then I can change the size of the mask to affect portions of the image, okay? So right here, I can just set it to this point, and that looks pretty good. Now I have control over these sliders. So if I think this is too bright, I can pull the brightness back in this area, okay? Or I can increase the contrast. I can do any number of things, okay? So I may drop on some images with this conversion in Nik several of these control points. You know, for instance, I may want to make the tonality of this tree a little bit brighter. So I'm going to drop a control point there. And once again, I'll click on the show selection box, and I'll just change the size of that until I get that tree mostly situated, okay? And then I can move it around. Now, you know, it's going to affect other parts of the image a little bit. That's how Nik is. It spreads out. So it's not as accurate as if you're doing dodging and burning with luminosity masks in Photoshop, which we'll get to a little bit later in the presentation, but it does do a pretty good job. All right, so I'm going to make that tree there a bit brighter, okay? And I can continue to go through the image, so on and so forth, until I figure out, and I want to get these leaves to be a little darker right in this area, okay? So once again, I'll create a control point. I'll let it kind of go across the board. You can notice that the whites are much more amplified or bright where the control point is, and it feathers out to the other side of the image. So I can make this adjustment to darken those leaves a little bit, and it's going to, you know, darken similar tonal values across the image, but it's not going to be as intense as where I put that control point on the shot. So this is a way that I can almost create sort of a dodging and burning and create that greater tonal depth in the image right inside of the Silver FX Pro 2 converter, all right? And then finally at the bottom, the last two are film types and finishing adjustments. I never use these, okay? You can play with these if you like, but film types is simply going to try to simulate popular films that were used back in the day, like Ilford Pan F Plus, very popular film. Ilford Delta 100 is something that I actually used to use when I shot film. And then Ilford FP4. Okay, so you can sort of play with these simulations if you want to try to get a certain film look to your images. I don't mess with these. I feel like I like the presets and doing the global and selective adjustments to get my conversion done. And then finally, you have finishing adjustments, split toning and vignetting, burn edges, and image borders. We're going to do all of this stuff later, and we can do it much, much more accurately, either using Lightroom or using Photoshop. So I'm not going to worry about that in the conversion process, in Silver FX Pro. Once you feel like you have your image converted in the platform here, you're simply going to hit save, all right? So it's going to go through the process of saving the image and updating the new black and white photograph into your Lightroom catalog, and we'll see that show up in just a minute. Excuse me. So there it is. We have, is that coming in yet? No, it's not in yet. It's still working. Just bear with me for a minute. She's still working her way through. Okay, here we go. So we have an edited TIFF now that has come in, and you can see that it's sitting right next to our original file. So this is after the black and white conversion with Nick, all right? Now, once you're back in Lightroom, you can continue to process the photo, okay? So if I jump into the develop panel, I can continue the process. And I'm gonna show you guys real quick a few things that I do inside of Lightroom before we step into some of the more complicated conversions to sort of do some very rudimentary dodging and burning on the shot and some basic vignetting, okay? So we'll finish this image all the way off at this point. Now, the first thing I do is I zoom out to 1/4, okay? 1:4 ratio. So I want the image to be a little bit smaller on my screen. And I do that for a reason, because I like to use radial filters. And when using radial filters, if the image is a little bit smaller, it's easier for me to place them on the shot and get good feathering. And I'll show you in a minute how that works. So for example, I want to darken just my corners of the photograph a little bit, okay? I'm gonna darken each corner independently because I want the light to really emanate from the center of the shot. So I'm gonna use a radial filter for that. So I'm going to grab my radial filter, which is right over here in my tools in Lightroom, and I'm going to draw a shape. All right. And I'm going to draw a pretty big shape, and I can position it any way that I want, but I want it to feather off. So you'll see at the center of the shape, there's a nodal point, right? And if I hover over that, you can see the red areas will be affected with whatever adjustment I do. So as I make this shape a little bigger, that darkening spreads into the photograph even further, okay? So we'll start with a point about like this, and I'm simply gonna start to pull the exposure back in this corner. And you can see the way that it feathers off. The adjustment is stronger right towards the corner than it is out here, okay? Because this is feathering just like a graduated filter would from the center point as it moves its way out with the radial, okay? And I can create as many of these radials as I want on the image. And sometimes I will do, you know, a dozen or more for the shot. So we'll darken this corner a little bit. Looks good. And then we'll just pull one over here. And you can be kind of rough with these too. It's kind of cool. You know, the old traditional way of darkroom work was using very rudimentary tools like cardboard that was cut out to do dodging and burning. So these radials do not have to be supremely precise. You're just sort of tone mapping areas of the image that you want darker or brighter. Another thing that I'll do a lot of times is I'll open up the exposure in the center of the photo. So I've darkened sort of my edges. You'll notice that I didn't darken this edge very much because I have this beautiful light kind of emanating from this corner from the sun rays. I may do a radial up here where I increase the texture and the clarity, the structure of it basically to bring out these rays a little bit more. But first thing I want to do is open the exposure in the center a little bit. Okay, so you can see how I'm creating this sort of beautiful light that's coming in through the image just using these radials. All right, so let's go through and do a new one right up here for the corner. And for this one, we're going to increase the clarity and the texture quite a bit. And let's see, pull the contrast up a little bit and the exposure up a little bit, just to really accentuate that light that's coming out of the corner of the shot, okay? So that's how you can use sort of these radial filters really around the edges of the shot or really anywhere you want in the photo to make these changes. I can draw them out however I want them to be. If I want just this little tree right here in this section to be a little brighter, I can draw out a radial that looks something like this. And I can increase the exposure a little bit, okay? I can do this throughout the photo, wherever I want. Now for this one, let's say I wanna brighten this tree, but I don't wanna brighten these leaves. That's when I would get into something by using a range mask, okay? So if I click on the range mask option down here now, I can go to luminance values. I can click on show luminance mask. Remember, the areas that are red are gonna be changed, and I can hide the adjustment from the highlights. So if I pull the highlight side of the slider and the range slider over, you see how those trees, the leaves are no longer red, but just sort of the darker tones of the trunk behind it are. I've hidden whatever adjustment I'm about to do from the brighter tones inside of this radial mask. So now I can pull the exposure up over here, and it's only going to really affect that tree. I could darken it as well, okay? I can do whatever I want to it. I'll pull it up just a little bit so it has some detail in it, all right? So you can continue to go through the image at this point to make all these little changes to the shot. I really do love the radial filter and the adjustment brush. We'll talk about the adjustment brush in a few minutes, but let's turn this off for a second. You see the difference just between using the radial filter, how we've created this greater contrast in the photo. And I'm going to stop share for 1 second, folks, just to check my Q&A. Pam said that alone was worth the webinar. Thank you, Pam. So let me just stop share and check my Q&A for a moment, because I want to make sure I'm keeping up with this. So Karim asked, in Lightroom, you work on a gray background. Why versus black background? And then Dave also asked, is there a reason you use long, thin radial filters to adjust the tree trunk rather than using a brush stroke? Okay, good questions. Let's jump back in for a moment into screen share. So, first question, gray background. So I typically like to use, I think that a black background is a little too much. In fact, to be quite honest with you, whenever I do any of my print preparation, I actually work on a white background. So I prefer to work on a white background when I actually prep my images for print. It allows me to see the tonal values a little bit more accurately in the image. Now, a black background is a little deceptive to me. So I prefer to use a medium gray or a dark gray when I do my processing. So you can see the way that it changes sort of the tonal values in the image. The darker you get, the darker the blacks look in the image, where they may not be to pure black yet. So I prefer to do my work on medium to dark gray for my initial processing. But when I get into prepping an image for print, I like to use a white background. This makes a lot of sense for me in a lot of ways, because a lot of the prints that I do will have a white border around them for the fine art prints. So I like to sort of simulate what the image looks like with a white border. Now, this is only for print preparation. This is it's very bright. It's hard to process like this when you're actually going through and trying to make these tonal separations from start to finish. So I do prefer the medium gray because it's lighter on the eyes, but it gives me sort of a simulation that's closer to a white background. And that's why I prefer that. Okay, so we've talked about a few things thus far. Let me just check something real quick. Thank you, Pam. Let's see, the black and white conversions using the channel mixer and then Silver FX Pro. And we're going to get a little deeper into this, but the next thing I want to show you guys, okay, and this is great, is using the Lightroom profiles. So let's go back to this image, this original photograph for a minute, okay, in color. And let's look at another way to do a black and white conversion on the shot. So another way that you can do this is to go into your basic tab. And what you'll notice is, let me reset this to Adobe Color. Okay, what you'll notice is if you come over to here where the profile tab is, over in the corner on the far right, there are 4 blocks here. Okay, if you click on this, you're going to get a variety of different profiles that you can work with. Now, I use these all the time. I use these not only for black and white conversions, I also use these for just my normal image development on color images. So for instance, if I look at the Adobe Raw profiles, I have Adobe Color, which is the standard profile that comes in through Lightroom or through the Adobe Raw converter in Photoshop. But you can change these, okay? So for instance, If I go to Adobe Landscape, you can see that right off the bat, I get a little bit more of a color punch, a little increase in contrast. It also opens up my shadows a little bit. If I'm looking for maximum dynamic range, shadow and highlight detail, I'll often use the Adobe Neutral profile, which is a lower contrast profile, but it brings out much, much more detail in the shadows, and it holds back the highlights a little bit. So it gives me a better starting point when I'm working on very high dynamic range images, all right? But what you have also down here is the black and white profiles. And so these are awesome. So these are sort of very similar to the profiles that you see in the Silver FX Pro converter. And you can simply hover on them and see the different effects on the image. So there, right there is the black and white red filter. If you hover up to the yellow filter, it's changing the tonal values of the photo. There's the green filter, the blue filter, and then they have these BW1 through 12 filters. So as I click through these, I can see different effects on the shot. So a lot of times for my conversions, I will start with one of these profiles for the black and white, the one that gives me the best tonal separation in the photo, especially for the style of the image that I'm going for. And I'll choose this as a starting point. All right. So let's say I want to start with, I don't know, for this image, maybe I like the black and white yellow filter. Okay. Once I click on that at the top, it shows me, okay, you're using the black and white yellow filter, and you can change the amount slider. Okay. Sort of for the intensity of the effect of the filter. If I drop it down to 0, I don't see anything. This would be exactly what it would look like if I just hit the black and white monochrome over in the basic tab. But as I move it up, the filtration becomes more apparent, okay? And I can move it above 100% and way the heck up there. You know, now I need to watch my histogram when I do this, because you'll notice as I moved it up to 200%, I'm clipping highlights in the image. So I would want to move it back down at this point and sort of back off of that a little bit, okay? And you can sort of just scale this to taste. And I kind of like it at maybe about 115 or so. And then once I'm done with that, I just click close. Now you can see in my profile, I have the black and white yellow filter profile. And I still have the amount slider. I can always move this around anytime I want up here, right? Now I can go in to start working on my tonal adjustments. You know, if I want to bring my highlights back a little bit, bring my shadows up a little bit, I can do all of that now. Give it a little texture, a little clarity, maybe a little dehaze action, just to increase that contrast. I can even still go down into my black and white mixer at this point and start to move my tonal values around a little bit, okay? Just like I did before, I'm just working off of that conversion, off of that profile that I just set up. So that's just giving me a little bit more contrast to work with there. One of the things we're going to get into in a few minutes is creating multiple copies of an image and applying different profiles and then selectively blending them together. That is like the ultimate effect to get your black and white conversion done. And we'll get into that in a few, but let's take a look at an image real quick, start to finish inside of Lightroom, to give you guys an idea of how we can take the image all the way through the process. This is a good candidate for a black and white conversion. Sort of a really dramatic, stormy image captured of the Sierra Nevada range in California, these crazy storm clouds. And, you know, there's not a lot of color in the shot. It was taken after sunset. It's exposed well. It's kind of got a little bit of a blue tone. Could make for an interesting sort of color image and sort of a bluer twilight. If I set this to more of like a daylight exposure with a little more blue, I get sort of a twilight blue shot. But I think it will make for a pretty interesting black and white conversion. So I'm going to start off by looking at some of my profiles for this particular image. And I will simply scroll through them. Now, I think I want to give the shot sort of a high key black and white because it has that sort of feel to it to me. So I don't want to use something like the black and white 4. The shadows become too dark. It's not as interesting with the contrast. Black and white 1 looks pretty good. Black and white 2 looks pretty good. If I scroll down here and look below at the bottom, BW11 isn't bad. Blue filter is interesting. Yellow filter is maybe too contrasty. Same with orange, same with red. I think I'm going to go with the black and white one to sort of give it this sort of, high key effect to bring out the whimsical nature and brightness of these storm clouds that are coming around, okay? Still keeping some nice shadow detail in the image, in the trees and in parts of the granite though, okay? So we haven't lost that yet. And remember, once again, we can move this amount slider around to change the effect, okay? So I'm gonna brighten this up a little bit, bring it to about 130, click close. So I have my profile set. Now I can do some of my global adjustments, okay? Or I can also look at my, my black and white adjustments down here. So maybe I wanna bring the blues down a little bit, I don't know. Another nice thing you can do is use this nodal point here. So if you're not sure what the color is up here on the image, because you can't see it, it's in black and white now, and I wanna darken this tone, I can just grab the nodal point, click on it, hover it out to the image, and then click and hold and either drag down to darken that tonal value or drag up to brighten that tonal value, okay? So I'm gonna darken that tonal value just a little bit. And you can see that it's darkening some parts of the granite of the mountain and the trees because it probably has a similar value in brightness with the aqua and the blue tones coming through, okay? So that allows me to sort of mess around with that a little bit. I can always just jump back into color every once in a while to get an idea of what the image looks like. And it's mostly blue, so I can change the white balance around a little bit too. I can say, okay, I want to grab some warmer and some more magenta tones in the image and then jump back into the black and white conversion and then go back down to the channel mixer and continue to make some changes to the shot to adjust the contrast of the image, okay? So remember, your white balance will change the conversion. You can keep it in black and white and move this around at this point, your temperature and your tint slider, to also affect sort of the overall tonal feel of the shot. I'm gonna keep it kind of bright, knowing that I'm gonna darken these areas up here, but selectively. I don't want this to get too dark down here. Now that conversion is looking pretty good so far, but I can, I'm just at the beginning of the process. I haven't even done any tonal work on the photograph down here in the tone section of the basic tab. I'm gonna pull the highlights back a little bit, bring a little bit more detail into these brighter highlights at the top. And I'm gonna bring the shadows up slightly, mostly to get good detail in this region of the shot, okay? But it's doing it globally, okay? So I'm just sort of kind of globally tone mapping the image out all the way across the board. And then I'm gonna zoom in 1:1 and look at an area with a pretty good fine detail and bring up the texture and the clarity just a little bit, just to bring a little bit more detail into these finer midtones throughout the image. So your texture and your clarity sliders are really going to affect your sort of the broader midtones in the shot, all right? All right, so that's looking pretty good. Try a little dehaze on the image. I got to be careful with dehaze because I'm going to lose sort of my high key look. If I pull this too far, the contrast becomes a little too intense, all right? So I'm going to just be a little bit more conservative and bring it up to about 15. That looks pretty good. All right. So things are looking great at this point. And now at this point in the process in Lightroom, everything else is going to be what I call selective adjustments. So selectively brightening and darkening regions of the photograph. And I'm going to show you how we can really transform this photograph and make it supremely dramatic and add a lot of depth to it just by doing some very, very simple darkening and lightening adjustments. And I'm going to use all three for an example for this. I'm going to use the grad filter, I'm going to use the radial filter, and I'm going to use the brush. So I'm going to start off with the grad filter and hit this big portion of the sky right here in the corner that I want to be darker. So I'm going to grab the grad and I'm going to pull it down at sort of an angle from the corner, just like this, okay? And then I'm going to pull the exposure back. And I'm going to pull the blacks back a little bit. And the highlights back, okay? Just to make these clouds and this stuff in the corner look a little bit more dramatic in the photo, okay? All right. And then I'm going to go ahead and jump into my radial filter, and I'm going to brighten right in the center here, okay? So like I have all this really, really, really great dark detail in parts of the mountain. So I'm going to draw a radial right over this area. I'm going to grab my range mask for luminance, make sure I show the luminance mask, and I'm going to hide the highlights. So I'm just brightening the darker tones, okay? Turn that off, and then I'm going to pull the exposure up a little bit, just like so. And I want to do the same thing for this area right here. So what I'll do is I'll just right click on this nodal point and click duplicate. And then I'll drag that nodal point because I have a new mask, and I'll resize it right for this portion of the shot right here. And I'll brighten some of those darker tones up right inside of the mountain, okay? And then finally, I'll grab my brush, and I'm gonna darken parts of the clouds, okay? So I'm gonna pull the exposure back by about a half of a stop. I can readjust this, it doesn't matter. And then I'm gonna just click and start to paint where the clouds are a little bit dark, okay? And so this is how I'm gonna create a lot of separation. So I want bright and dark tones mixing against one another, okay? So you'll notice that I never go all the way, and I can change the size of that brush all the way into all of the whites. Just portions of it that are already dark are going to get a little bit darker through the conversion process, okay? And that looks pretty good. I'm going to back off of that a little bit just by pulling the exposure slider back around, and I'll click new. So I'm going to do a new one right up here. I'm going to darken some of these clouds a little bit. See, now the beautiful thing is with using the brush like this is because I clicked and selected on a dark portion of the image, those clouds are already dark where I started to paint. Because I have auto mask set up, it's sort of taking that into consideration. Well, it's not sort of, it's definitely taking that into consideration as I paint across the image. So it's not, as you can see, doing as much into the brighter tones. It will do it a little bit, but not nearly as much as when I hit those darker tones. So it's sort of allowing that darkening effect to really apply mostly to the darker tones in those portions of the shot. Now you can see right off the bat, just with the dodging and burning with that, how much more depth to the image there is. It's much, much more dramatic. Now I can always go back to any of these if I think I overdid it, click on it, hover, it'll show the areas in red that I painted. And I can say, okay, I darkened that a little too much. Let's bring it back to only about like a third of a stop. And then the same with this up here. It's a little too much. So we'll bring it back a little bit. I can continue to go through the image and paint this brightening or darkening effect just using the exposure slider and the brush anywhere through the photo, okay? Anywhere through the photo. I'll do a new one right here where I'm going to increase the shadows just in the face of the mountain where some of those trees are a little darker, okay? Just a little bit, just to bring out a little bit more detail behind the clouds. And once again, create a little bit more depth in the photo. All right, you can see the before and the after with the adjustment brush. Much, much more dramatic of a photo at this point, okay? So that is a typical conversion kind of all the way through inside of Lightroom. Now, the last thing I would do to the shot is add some, go to 1/8, is add some vignetting to the photo, okay? And so one of the ways that I like, so there are a couple ways you can do this, by the way. So you can either use the effects tab down here. Let me just bring this up so it's bigger for everyone. And, use the post-crop vignette to darken the shot a little, okay? And this is fairly effective. This works pretty well, all right? But one of the ways that I like to do it, and the reason I like to do it is because not all corners I want to darken as much as others. So these corners down here are already pretty dark towards the bottom of the photo. The top is a little brighter. So what I'll do a lot of times is use grad filters, and I'll drag them down from the side like this, about not quite halfway into the photo, right from the corner, and just pull the exposure back a little bit. right in from the corner. Let's do about a half a stop. And then I'll do a new one. I'll do it from the same, same sort of shape, but from this side over here, and pull it back. Maybe a little bit more because it's brighter over on this side. And then I'll do a new one. Now I'm going to do from the bottom corner coming up, maybe not as far into the photo. And then once again, I'm going to pull the exposure back. But because it's already dark down there, I'm not going to pull it back as far as I did for the top. And then finally one for this corner at the bottom. And I'm not going to go in quite as far for that one because it has sort of those dark trees in it once again. Now, once again, I could also set up a range mask for any one of these. So as I pull the darkness in from this corner, I've noticed that my trees back through here have gotten a little too dark. So I'll come into my luminance values and I'll hide the adjustment from the shadows. So it's only hitting more of the mid and bright tones in the image. All right. And then, so there's a way that I can create sort of a very custom vignette for my black and white photo. Now I got a few Q&As that I saw that came in and I can't see them in my live screen view. So I'm going to stop share for just a moment, folks, so I can address any questions that came in. So just give me one moment. And let's take a look at the Q&A. So, okay. Pam asked, can you protect the highlights and shadows here as well? So anytime you're using an adjustment, a selective adjustment, whether that's a graduated filter, a radial filter, or the adjustment brush, you can protect the highlights or the shadows using the range mask, okay? So we kind of went into that a little bit. I'll break back into that in a moment and show you guys a little bit more about how that works, okay? Norris asked, do you find that as Lightroom gets better, you are using Nik less? Yes, I do. In fact, I've used Nik less and less over the years. I still like it. Still a good conversion software, but a lot of the stuff can be done inside of Lightroom, especially with those profiles that you get that we talked about just a little bit ago. And then Sherry asked, you were talking about adjustments in terms of stops. How does that relate to the numerical values on the adjustment sliders? Great question. Let's jump back in and I'll show you guys how that relates. So when I say something like a stop, for instance, let's bring up the adjustment brush and I'll brush right here for a moment, okay? When I move the exposure slider, that's where I'm talking about stops. That's like a stop of exposure, like stopping the lens down or stopping the shutter speed down or opening it up, okay? So when you go to 1.0, that is one full stop of exposure adjustment, okay? Or whether you're increasing or decreasing. 2 point whatever is 2 stops. Then you get all the way up in here to 4 stops, okay? For an image. So that gives you quite a bit, okay? So that's what I'm referring to when I say bringing this down by about a stop, all right? But you don't really need to focus on that too much, to be quite honest with you. Just do it to sight, okay? Just move the exposure, whether you're trying to darken something, to wherever it looks good to your eye on the screen, all right? So like, for instance, this, if it's 0.5, is about a half of a stop of an adjustment, okay? That I could paint into this area right at the top, all right? But you want to create that deep sort of contrast in your black and white images where you have, good brights and good darks coming all the way through the shot. As I look at this even more, I'm going to want to do some more adjustments to the photo where I'm actually amplifying the exposure on some of the clouds along the edge of where those darks are, okay? Once again, creating that sort of deep contrast in the photo, all right? A lot of times what I'll do, guys, is I'll paint right through an image all the way, and then I'll go back and then just adjust the sliders down a little bit. So if I know I want to really increase the contrast on these parts of the clouds, that's too much. Even at 0.29, of brightness, I'll bring it back down to 0 and just move it up slowly. And maybe something about 0.10 or 0.15, somewhere in that range. Like I said, you just got to do it to what looks good to the eye. You're always keeping your histogram up so you can evaluate that, because as you brighten some of these exposures, you may start to clip out detail in the highlights or the shadows. You can always turn these little guys on right here. So if you do start to do that, like, so if I go in here and I'm painting and I start to lose detail in the image somewhere, which this looks ridiculous, but anyway, it'll come out as white clipping on the shot, okay? I don't want that, obviously, but I want this to be just a little bit brighter. Okay. All right, so that looks pretty good. Let's take a look at a before and after on this particular image. So from color to black and white conversion, you can see that we've taken a very soft and subtle sort of twilight image, a very like twilight blue sort of shot, and we've created a really dramatic black and white conversion out of it. Now let's talk a little bit about combining conversions together, okay? This will be the most advanced aspect that we go over tonight, all right? And for that, we're gonna look at this particular shot, once again from the Eastern Sierra in California. I'm gonna go ahead and adjust the white balance first a little bit to get a little bit more blue in that sky and a little bit more of a sort of magenta tone in the foliage. And then I'm gonna jump straight in to my different profiles, all right? So what I'm going to want to do here, actually, before I do that even, I'm going to put two different images together. So I'm going to come down to the image thumbnail, and you can do this whether you're in the library or in the develop mode. And I'm going to right click on the thumbnail and go up to create virtual copy. So that's going to give me two identical images to work with, but I'm going to do different conversions in Lightroom for each one and then selectively put them together in Photoshop. You know, think about this as if you do exposure blending, where you're taking an exposure for the sky and then an exposure for the land, and you develop each one independently a little bit in Lightroom and then put them together in Photoshop. So we're going to do sort of the very same methodology, but for a black and white conversion. So for the first one, I'm going to work on the sky. All right, I want to create a lot of depth, a lot of drama in that sky. So for this first image here, when I click on the profile, I'm going to look for a profile that does a good job of bringing out a lot of cool detail in the clouds in the image. So I'm just going to kind of scroll through them. Like this one, for instance, looks really cool for the background. Foreground's gotten kind of weak, but I've got a lot more tonal separation coming through the background with this black and white number 10. And then once again, I can increase that a little bit using the slider. All right, so that's looking pretty good. And then once I get into this point, I'll do some tonal work through the basic tab and the tone curve and even the white balance settings to get it just right where I want it to be, okay? So I'll pull the highlights back a little bit more. And let's see, I'm gonna give it a little bit of a dehaze adjustment for the sky to bring out the clouds. I don't care what's happening down below. Basically, so you can see this ridge of cottonwood trees in the background that's still being lit by the sun. Anything below that looks flat. I'm going to do a different conversion to the second image, and we'll blend them together selectively. Right now, we're just working on basically the top half of the photo, if that makes sense. All right, let's go down into my tone curve, and I'm going to amplify my highlights a little bit, right till I get to the point where I clip out, and I'm going to decrease my shadows. Now, it's really doing quite a bit of a job down here, but it's also creating some nice depth up in the mountains when I decrease the shadows, okay? And I don't care if this clips out, because remember, I'm going to do a completely different conversion for the bottom half of the photo. All right, so that's looking pretty good. Just do a little bit more highlight protection here in the basic tab. And finally, I'm going to grab a grad filter. I'm going to bring it in right on the top of the photo, just about like that. And I'm going to just sort of dramatically darken the top of the shot. I want those clouds to really come out. Now, I don't want these white clouds to get darker, so I'm going to use the range mask, go to the luminance setting in range mask, click on show luminance mask, Drag this down a little deeper into the image, and then protect the highlights by pulling from the right to the left, okay? So I'm only really working on the midtones and the shadows with this graduated filter. So now I can really begin to pull the exposure down on the back part of the sky by keeping but also keeping these really nice, brighter highlights in the clouds. All right, I can also amplify the blacks down a little bit to make that a little more dramatic up there. And then I'll just do a new filter and bring it down right like this, because I want to bring out these clouds. I want them to really stand out. And I'll do a range mask for this one, but this time I'll protect the shadows and really only work on the highlights in the shot. All right. I just got to move this around. So you can see this is barely going to work on parts of those clouds up there with that range mask. And I'll amplify the whites. I just got to be careful that I don't go too far into the mountain and start to lose detail in the snowy bits. But that looks pretty good. You see how my sky has a lot more of a dramatic punch now with just those two adjustments. Now that I have my mountains and my sky conversion looking pretty solid, I want to look at my second photo for the sage and the reeds down below that are in shade, okay? So once again, I'm going to jump into my basic tab and go into my profiles and just start looking for something that creates good separation in the bottom portion of the photo. Red looks pretty good. Red or orange so far looks pretty nice. And some of these look, that black and white one looks pretty sweet, actually. I'm gonna go with BW2. I like the kind of the separation that it creates down here. It's very nice. Crease it a little bit. And you can see I have some blacks that are clipped out. I'll just move my black slider up a little bit and then my shadow slider up a little bit. And then I'm gonna jump in and I'm gonna look at this 1-to-1 and I'm gonna add a bunch of texture and some clarity to really pop out the detail in these reeds at the bottom portion of the photo. Now, the background of the image looks like garbage at this point with this conversion, but that doesn't matter. I'm not worried about that. Just worried about what's happening down below. All right, let's pull the shadows back a little bit so we almost get a little bit of clipping in the blacks to create that really deep contrast between dark and light. And that looks pretty good. Okay, so now I need to sort of selectively mix these two photos together. You can see that my photo on the left has got some good drama for the mountains and the brighter bits of the image. And the image on the right has much better separation in the reeds. Now I got to put them together. So I have both images selected in Lightroom. It's now time to take these images into Photoshop to bring them together into one photo. So I'm going to come up to Photo and go to Edit In, and then drop all the way down to Open as Layers in Photoshop. This will save me a step in the process in Photoshop, and it's going to launch both images into a single layer stack, okay? And we'll let it do its thing for a moment. And what we'll see here in a minute I just got to rearrange my workspace for a moment. There we go. There's my layers right here. So you guys can see them. I'm going to bring them up nice and big. So we have two images in the layer stack. I'll turn the top image off. So you can see the bottom image is the conversion for the foreground, and the top image is the conversion for the background. Now I need to selectively put these two together. Now the best way to do this, especially when you have a shot that's fairly simple like this, where it's sort of split down the center of the photo, is to use a very simple mask and an adjustment brush, okay? So I'm going to add a mask to this, and the mask is white. So we're not seeing any change. But if I start to paint black on the mask and start to hide this portion of this photo, the one below it will begin to shine through. So watch as I do that. As I grab my brush B, I can use my bracket keys to size it accordingly. I want to make sure that black is my foreground color and I'm at 100% opacity. As I start to paint on the image, I'm actually not painting on the photo, I'm actually painting on the mask, okay? So as I paint black on the mask, like so, it's allowing what's below it to be revealed, okay? So I can just simply begin to paint through this portion of the photo to selectively blend them together, okay? And I don't have to paint it uniformly. I can decide what areas I want to bring in as brighter and what areas I want to bring in as darker. I can even do this with the brush at different opacity settings, okay, for less effect. So I'll take my opacity down to about 20% now, lower the size of my brush, and bring in a little bit more detail into some of these areas through here. But you can see as I did the conversion through here, I've created this sort of three-dimensional depth between the light and the dark areas of the conversion. And when we take a look at the mask in a moment, you'll see that it looks a bit strange. You see some areas are black, some areas are sort of a gray paint to them, all right? And some areas are white. So it's allowing just portions of that conversion from below to sort of come through. And you can continue to go through here with different opacity settings for your brush to reveal or to conceal areas of the photograph. So if I thought this got too bright here, I'm simply going to switch the mask, or I'm sorry, the brush back to white and just paint over this a little bit so I don't have as much detail in that area. And I can come back with black and begin to reveal it again and get it just right, okay? So I'm creating that sort of three-dimensional depth. You see the three-dimensional depth that we have in the image at this point? All right, now maybe I want to brighten these cottonwood trees up a little bit as well that are coming through this part of the conversion below, all right? Create, once again, the separation between the trees and the mountains in the background. Well, I'm going to zoom in on the photo and I'm going to use a much smaller brush, okay? But before I do that, I want to show you guys how we can use a luminosity mask to take care of a portion of the image that's a little bit more complicated like this. So I'm going to flatten the photo, all right? So I'm happy with the bottom part of the conversion. I'm going to jump back into Lightroom and take my bright conversion here and just open it in Photoshop. I can do this as many times as I want. I could do as many images as I want. I could do one little conversion for one plant at a time and keep blending them in. Now, once I have that image back into Photoshop, I'm going to go Command A or select all, and then edit, copy, or Command C. All right. Go back to the original shot and then paste it. So I'm going to go edit, paste, or Command V. Once again, I'm going to add a layer to this. This time it's going to be a black mask to the layer, okay? So I'm going to hold down Alt-Option and add a black mask because I only want to reveal, or I'm sorry, you know what I want to do? I want to just actually dump this out for a moment. Just let me dump this out for a moment. And I don't have any mask associated with it. I'll take a look at my Tony Kuiper luminosity masks. Now look at my rapid mask, and I'm going to look for a mask using one of these zonal masks. And so I can find one that does a good job of just bringing those trees in. Like that looks pretty good, okay? That looks pretty good right there, all right? So I'm going to modify this mask a little bit, and I'm going to go with, let's see, this is V6. I want a V7. V7. V7 rapid mask. Thank you very much. I'm going to go with my black brush, and I'm just going to mask out most of the mountains in the image, okay? So I'm just leaving those trees set with the luminosity masks, okay? And I'm just masking out the top portion of the sky, because I'm never going to get it exactly right when I'm looking at a black and white with the TK thing, because there are other tones in the air and the image that are gonna come through. Okay, so I'm just going to kind of mask out and just really apply it to the trees in the center of the image. Okay, and the mask can be sort of rough, rudimentary. Okay, we'll lower the opacity. It's not going to matter. So once I get that basic mask selected, I'm just going to apply it to this. Okay, so now you can see how I have these brighter trees coming through the center of the photo. Now let me zoom in so you guys can see that. You see how I brought that other conversion back in and just masked it into these trees, and it spreads out nicely into the background, so it looks very natural. It's one of the great things about using the luminosity masks, is it's a very subtle gradial flow out, but you can see the great amount of depth that I've just created in the image all the way from front to back with this black and white conversion. I'm going to stop share for a moment because we have some Q&As that have come in. Just bear with me. All right, let's see what came up in the box. All right, so Norris was asking, what is the Tony Kuiper panel we glimpsed? Tony Kuiper panel is a luminosity panel that I use. I've done some webinars on that with using the TK panel. I'm not going to get too deep into it tonight because there will be a lot of people that haven't used it yet. But if you want to get more information on that, you can go to Tony's website, which is www.goodlight.us. And so basically the luminosity panel allows me to make very, very specific luminosity selections based on tonal and color values for a variety of different adjustments, whether it's dodging and burning or color adjustments or blending and things of that nature. Okay, so it's definitely something you should look into. They're rather inexpensive. It's about $40 for the panel. And once you get to learn how it's laid out, it's pretty easy to use. And then Pam asked, what version of TK am I using? I'm using TK7. So I'm using TK7. I had originally, had brought up TK6 panel, which is the old panel. And I just haven't deleted that from my Photoshop library yet. But I wanted to use the TK7 panel because it's much more advanced than the TK6 panel. Okay. So there is the conversion, okay? Now at this point, I can continue to refine the image and do that dodging and burning that I want to do. Now, this is where I'll get into talking about the TK panel a little bit more, okay? Because this is where the TK panel, in my opinion, becomes just absolutely incredible, all right? So for instance, I'm in Photoshop at this point, and I want to continue to dodge and burn my shot to really create that beautifully tone mapped image, okay? I want my sky up here, well, just the darker tones to be darker in the image, okay? So what can I do? Now I can come over and let me just flatten this for a moment. I can come over and I can create a duplicate layer, Command J, and I could use maybe one of these dodging and burning tools that's built into the toolbar in Photoshop. So I can say, okay, I want to burn to darken. Remember, burning is to darken and dodging is to lighten an image. And I can say, okay, I want to darken just the shadows. And I can start to paint in here, and it does a pretty decent job, it does a pretty good job. But I can do a much more accurate job of it by using a TK mask. So let's go into the TK7 rapid mask panel. And what you'll notice is here in the rapid mask panel, we have our luminosity masks. We have darks and we have lights and we have midtones. So I want to darken the sky and just the darker parts of the sky. So I'm going to look for a dark mask that's going to work best for this. So if I'm going to click on dark 1, it's going to show me a mask. Okay, so remember the way mask works in Photoshop is light is going to reveal the adjustment and dark is going to conceal the adjustment. As I go down from 1 to 2, the mask becomes less broad, okay? It's narrowing the selection down. You can see on this selection, just those darker parts of the sky are being illuminated on the mask. So that looks good for me. So what I'll do now is I'll make an adjustment to this, and I'll come down to the bottom here, and I'm going to select a burn adjustment. When I select the burn adjustment, it automatically gives me a dodge burn layer. It changes my color to black, and it gives me a paintbrush. So now I can start to just brush in, and it will only hit the darker regions of the mask where I paint on the image. So you can see how I'm painting through here in the sky, and it's only darkening those parts of the photo. I'll just turn this on and off for a moment. See how my blacks amplified in the sky, but my brights have not gotten any darker. In fact, they look brighter now because I've darkened what's behind them. All right, so now I can continue to go through the image and really work this out. Let's look at another mask. I want to darken some of the darker parts in the sky down here. So I'll use a darks 1, and I'll do another burn adjustment. I get a whole new layer to start from scratch, and I'll start to darken just the dark tones right through here, through the top of the mountains and these parts of the clouds. You can see that I'm creating this sort of deeper depth in the top of the image with this selective dodging and burning, all right? Down here, I may want to lighten some areas up a little bit. So I'll look for a dark mask number 2. I'll try that. And we'll go with a number 3. And I want to brighten some of the darker tones in the rabbit brush, the sage, and the cottontails down here. So for this one, I'll do a dodge adjustment. And I'll do this at maybe 50%. And I'll just start to lighten some of those darker tones in the shot. So it's not too dark down in that area, okay? And I don't have too much contrast to work with, all right? And that looks better. So I'm bringing it back. I'm sort of evening out the tonal values in the image, still allowing for this great amount of depth through the shot, but just making it look much more subtle to the viewer. All right, and I can keep going through this. I can keep selecting as many of these as I want. If I think my bright values, and in fact I do, I think the bright values right along this ridge of clouds is too bright, I can look at a lights mask. And I'm just going to click through them until I find the proper lights mask. It only brings out the brightest values in the image. And then for that, I'm going to go ahead and burn those or darken those down a little bit so they're not as bright as they are. I can have a little bit more detail in them. All right, so I'm just going to continue to go through. Then I do this on all of my images as I continue to go through and then just do this really selective dodging and burning on the shots until I get all the tonal values exactly where I want them to be in the image, and it looks good overall. You can see the difference just with doing 1, 2, 3, 4 different adjustments for dodging and burning, how different the image looks overall. Okay, you see the difference? It's much more evenly, the tonality is much more evenly dispersed throughout the shot. I still have maintained excellent contrast and depth in the image by creating these light and dark tones working their way all the way through the photo. Just sort of selectively, touch them up a little bit. I can go through more and more. As I look at the shot, I think, okay, the blacks through here in these cottonwoods are a little intense. So I'll look for a dark mask that really just hits those darker areas back there, and I'll do some dodging for that. I'll take the brush down, and I'll just get in and lighten those areas up just a touch, just to bring it back to where I want it to be, okay? So that looks a little better to my eyes, and I have a little bit more detail back there for the print than I would have had had I not done that. And then a lot of times what I'll do at the end of the image is I'll bring it down pretty small, I'll flatten it, I'll flatten the layers, and I'll just take a look at it and study it for a bit. Sometimes I'll even step away from the photo for the evening, or at least for a little while, just to, kind of reset my creative vision, come back and make sure that I'm doing things right. When I look at this, I still want my sky at the top to be a little darker because I want to balance out the darkness at the bottom of the shot. So I can use a variety of methods for that, but I think what I'll do here is I'll just create a duplicate layer, Command J, and I think I'll change the blending mode from normal to multiply, and I will come over and just add a white mask and grab my gradial filter, and then just drag down a little bit from the top, and then reduce the opacity of that gradial filter just to darken the top a little bit. Just, you see how it's dark at the bottom? I want to create just a little bit of balance between the two. That way the eye stays maintained in the center of the photograph a little bit longer. All right, so I would consider this to be a very successful black and white conversion at this point. And I would, in black and white image, all the way done with the dodging and burning. And I'll go ahead and save it now. And once I save it, it's going to update to the original folder that the files were saved in, and I'll get it inside of Lightroom. So we can look at the finished version of it right here. In fact, let's take a look at all three of these for a moment. You can see this image over here on the far left was the conversion that we did for the sky and the mountains, the background of the photo. This conversion is what we did for the plant life down in the foreground. And then this is after the image was selectively put together, these two, and then with some dodging and burning to finish off the tonality through the shot to give it that great amount of contrast and depth. But the good news is when we look at this, we have excellent detail from pure black to pure white without any clipping. So this is going to print very well. I see a little bit of clipping happening right here. So I'm finally just going to pull the highlight slider back a little bit just to make sure that I don't have any pure clipping in my print. And then if I were going to soft proof this for printing at this point, I would change the background to white to make sure that I'm checking all of my tonal values. See, when I change it to white, my blacks look a little too amplified. So I'm going to increase the shadows a little bit probably. But before I do that, I want to, where is it? I forget check my shortcuts for a minute because I'm forgetting. Old age. Yeah, S. All right, sorry about that. So if I hit S, I get my soft proofing, okay, which is where this comes into where I can soft proof the image before it goes to the printer. And I'm going to want to choose the type of paper that I'm printing it on. And it will sort of simulate what that's going to look like. All right. So a lot of the stuff that I do on the Pantene luster paper for my Epson printer. So I'll load that as my soft proof with perpetual intent. I'll simulate the paper and the ink. It's changed the image around a little bit. You can see the difference. It's a little darker. I've lost some highlight detail in it. So once I have that set up, I'll create a proof copy, something to work on, and I'll increase the exposure a little bit. Just basically try to get it back to what I saw when I was processing the shot before I send it to the printer. Okay, and so I do a lot of printing at home on my Epson printers, especially for the fine art stuff. So it's really important to sort of do this soft proofing and to simulate what the paper is going to look like. And if you have your monitor calibrated well, that may be a webinar that I do in the future is for monitor and printer calibration. But anyway, if you have that stuff calibrated correctly, you can do a soft proof like this and you're going to get a very excellent result. You might have to do a couple test prints for a master file first, but once you get your proof copy set up and you get everything set up for the paper that you're printing with, you should theoretically be able to just send the print or send the image to the printer from now on and get very consistent results out of it. Let me stop share for a moment, get some Q&As that came in. So Sherry asked two questions, which are both good. Can you share a bit about how you manage files between Lightroom and Photoshop so you don't lose your edits? And she's having trouble with her computer being sluggish when working with a lot of adjustment brushes inside of Lightroom. So yeah, the thing with Lightroom is a resource hog. Okay, especially if you have Lightroom and Photoshop running at the same time, or Lightroom running with other programs running in the background. And yes, as you're using different adjustment brushes or radial filters or grad filters, it builds up a lot of history inside of Lightroom, and it can become very sluggish. The only thing you're going to be able to do for that, Sherry, is to basically upgrade your system, unfortunately. So you have more RAM working in the background, so your computer is running faster. I had the same problem with Lightroom until, especially with working on these larger 50 megapixel files. It was very sluggish. I had to upgrade my entire desktop system to run with about, I think I'm running 128 gigabytes of RAM through the engine to keep things moving. The other thing you can do is make sure that you don't have any other programs open in the background when you're working on Lightroom. And just be patient, basically, because that is my biggest gripe with Lightroom. It is a resource hog, and it does tend to slow the computer down for a lot of people if they don't have it up and running. And then how do I manage my files between Lightroom and Photoshop with my edits? So just to give you guys a quick idea of how that works, I've been working with a quick collection over here for the webinar. But if we jump into a folder like my Death Valley folder from this past winter. Basically, I star everything, okay, that is a finished copy. So as I work in Lightroom and I'm finished and I save it back into the catalog, it updates it into the original folder that I'm in. And then I simply 5-star my finished edits. And if I click on attribute, I can see all of my finished edited photos from any particular shoot. All right, so it's always going to maintain the files right back into the original folder that you were working with, and it will show you whether or not it is a raw file or a processed file from Photoshop, just by basically clicking on the I command or the info button, and you'll see that this is a PSD file. It's a Photoshop document, so this one has been into Photoshop, and the one right next to it is the original raw file. So this is the raw file with edits done in Lightroom, and this is the raw file after my edits inside of Photoshop. They sit right next to one another. And then if I just click on the info button, I can see, the file information for it. Okay. All right. Well, I feel like I'm going to jump back into, I'm going to stop the screen share. I feel like we probably covered enough for this evening, and I'm going to take any questions that folks may have. In fact, I see a couple things came into the chat, so let me take a look at that for a moment. So Helen asked, well, first of all, thank you, Helen, for that kind comment. Will you be able to rewatch the video? Yes. So I have been recording the session. Once it's done recording, it'll process. I'll get it up to my YouTube channel. I'll send everyone that signed up for the webinar a link, and you can view the webinar as many times and for as long as you want to. So that will be available, and you'll get that within 24 to 48 hours. And then also Pam asked, am I using different versions of TK7? No, I'm not. I'm using the TK7 exclusively now, Pam. I still have the older version TK6 on my computer just because I haven't removed it yet. And I'll keep it up because sometimes I do private tutoring with folks that may have, that may not be using the TK7. Some of them are using the TK6. So I keep it handy in case I need to use that for any sort of instruction. But the TK7 is much better, and they've made some incredibly nice improvements to it. So it's definitely worth having. Sam asked, would you recommend a layer stamp instead of flatten? This way you retain your lower layers. Yes, that's a great point, Sam. That is definitely something that you should probably do, is use the layer stamp. That way you're not throwing away all of those adjustments you did, and you can go back and fix that later if you need to. Just do bear in mind that as you guys build up these layers, the file size is getting huge. It's not uncommon for me to, if I don't do a layer stamp or a flattening of the image at some point, to get file sizes that are, 1.5 gigs for an image, which is huge. You can slow down your system quite a bit. So layer stamp is definitely a good way to do it. Also, I think if you get very comfortable in your editing process, you can always flatten your image. Remember, you always have your raw file to go back to if you need to start from the beginning again. Let's see. Jill said, great instruction, Joe. You are a very good teacher. Thank you. She's interested in the monitor and printer calibration. I think that's something that I'll dig into once I finish up with the fall workshop. So keep a mind out for that. Nancy's going to attend tomorrow's session. I have a session tomorrow on advanced dodging and burning. We went into dodging and burning a little bit tonight. We're going to get into it a little bit more tomorrow evening if anyone's interested in that. And one of the other things I'll talk about in that webinar is dodging and burning with color. Some call it painting with color, but I call it dodging and burning with color, because you can use different styles, different opacities of color to add color, but also add darkness and lightness to an image. So you can get the best of both worlds. So it's a really, really great little thing. If you guys are interested in that, you can find more information on my website to sign up for tomorrow night's webinar. If anybody wants to come, I appreciate that. Sherry, or Jill said, is Sherry using a Mac? She can go into the manage under the Apple to get rid of miscellaneous files. Yeah, there's definitely some things you can do. I won't be able to get into all of those tonight, Sherry, for speeding up your system. But if you do a Google search, like Lightroom is being sluggish with it, whatever if you're using a Mac, I'm assuming you're using a Mac probably, it seems to be more prevalent on that. There are some settings that you can do to speed up your system a little bit. So looking forward to seeing you tomorrow as well, Pam. Yeah, Jill, so for anyone that's still listening, for any webinar that you guys sign up for, whether you come into the attendance live or whatever, you're going to get the recorded version of it later. So, if I'm doing a webinar that you're extremely interested in, but you can't make it for some reason, whatever that may be, if you sign up for it, you will get a recorded version of it that you can view, infinity, as many times as you want after that. All right, guys. Well, thank you all so much for coming into the webinar this evening. I hope that, that you learned a lot. I hope that it was instructional and helpful. I hope to see everyone again on a future webinar. If you guys have any questions that come up after the fact, please just send me an email. I'll try to get back to you as quickly as I could. And I just appreciate your support and hope everyone stays happy and safe. And hopefully I'll see you guys tomorrow night. Remember to visit my website, www.josephrossback.com, and you can see all of the webinars that we have available there on the website, and also all the workshops and other educational offerings that we have. So thanks everyone, stay safe, stay happy, and I will see you guys soon. I'm going to end the webinar now. Peace.